The city was not yet awake, but the bakery was alive. It breathed. It was a living thing, warm and smelling of yeast and the faint, sweet ghost of caramelized sugar. Before the first hint of gray light touched the steel and glass towers downtown, this small brick building on a forgotten street corner exhaled the scent of honest work. Inside, under the low hum of the proofing cabinet and the patient ticking of a wall clock, a man moved with an economy of motion that was less a skill and more a state of being. His name was Elias, though the name, like the flour-dusted apron he wore, was a uniform. It was camouflage. He was the baker. He was not a man who smiled easily, not a man given to small talk. He was described by his movements. The precise fold of dough, a motion repeated 10,000 times until it was part of his muscle memory, a physical prayer. The way he scored the top of a loaf, not with a flourish, but with 3 swift, decisive strokes of the lame. It was not an act of decoration. It was an act of engineering, allowing the steam to escape, ensuring the integrity of the crust. Each loaf was a structure, and he was its architect. His hands, dusted white, were clean and strong. They were not the hands of a man who had only ever known dough. There was a stillness in them when they were at rest, a coiled potential. He worked in a rhythm dictated by the needs of the yeast and the heat of the oven, a rhythm that had nothing to do with the frantic pulse of the city that would soon roar to life around him. This small world of flour, water, salt, and fire was his sanctuary. It was a fortress built of routine, each perfectly baked loaf another stone in the wall that separated him from a life he had burned to the ground. At the back of the shop, in a space filled with steam and the clatter of metal on porcelain, another rhythm kept time. It was the sound of Maria. She was the dishwasher. Her hair was a net of silver and black, her face a map of a life lived without safety nets. She moved more slowly than Elias, her shoulders stooped from decades of labor, but there was a similar dignity in her work. She did not just wash dishes, she cleansed them. She stacked the clean plates with a gentle precision, her gnarled fingers handling the heavy ceramic as if it were precious. Her presence was a quiet counterpoint to his. They rarely spoke more than a few words each morning. A soft good morning, a nod, an offer of the day's first imperfect roll, still warm from the oven, which she always accepted with a gratitude that felt ancient and profound. He knew of the worry that etched the lines around her eyes a little deeper each week. He had overheard her quiet, desperate phone calls in the alley behind the shop, her voice a fragile thread of Spanish pleading with hospital administrators, with insurance agents, with God, her grandson. A name, Mateo, and a sickness that required a sum of money so vast it was an abstraction, a cruel joke. This morning, the air was different. The usual peace felt thin, stretched taut. Elias felt it in the way the flour seemed to cling to the air, in the unusual silence from Maria's corner. He slid a tray of baguettes from the oven, the crust a perfect deep gold. The smell should have been satisfying. Today, it smelled like a lit fuse. He glanced toward the back. Maria was not washing. She was standing perfectly still, her hands gripping the steel edge of the sink, her knuckles white. She was staring at the front door, her breath held tight in her chest. Outside, a car had pulled to the curb, its engine a low, predatory growl that did not belong in the quiet dawn. The clock on the wall ticked. The sound was no longer patient. It was a countdown. The bell above the door did not jingle. It was jolted, a sharp, discordant clang that shattered the morning's fragile peace. The man who entered was a violation of the space. He was not a customer. Customers did not move like that, with a slouching, sideways drift, as if scanning for threats and opportunities in equal measure. He wore a suit that was expensive, but looked cheap on him. The fabric strained across his thick shoulders. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, but they scuffed the floor with an insolent disregard. He was a shark that had mistaken this small, quiet pond for the open ocean. He did not look at the bread. His eyes, small and dark, swept the room and settled on Elias. A smirk crawled onto his face. It was the expression of a man who had never been told no, or at least had never heard it. He sauntered to the counter, his movements a performance of casual dominance. The air thickened with the cloying scent of his cologne, a chemical sweetness that fought with the honest smell of the bakery and lost. "Name's Rico," he said. The words were not an introduction. They were a claim, like a dog marking its territory. He leaned against the counter, his posture designed to intimidate, to shrink the space between them. "Mr. Sylvan sends his regards." Elias did not react. He continued to arrange the loaves on the cooling rack, his movements deliberate, unhurried. The name Sylvan hung in the air, a name that carried weight in certain parts of the city. It was a name associated with shadows and whispers, with transactions that happened in back rooms, and were sealed with handshakes or with fear. Elias had heard it. In a city like this, it was impossible not to. He finished with the last loaf and turned to face the man. His expression was neutral, his eyes giving nothing away. He was not a baker. He was a wall. "What can I do for you?" he said. His voice was level, calm. It was not the voice of a man who was impressed or afraid. Rico's smirk widened. He seemed to find Elias's composure amusing, a novelty. He slid a heavy canvas duffel bag onto the polished wood of the counter. The bag landed with a dense, soft thud. The sound of money. A lot of it. "Mr. Sylvan has a great appreciation for small, local businesses," Rico said, his tone oozing a false sincerity. "He believes in community. He wants to make an investment, a partnership." He slid the zipper open a few inches, revealing tight, paper-banded stacks of $100 bills. A silent, ugly fortune. "We put this into your books. A little extra flour, a little more yeast. At the end of the month, you give us back 70%. The rest is yours. A gift. For your trouble." It was not a business proposal. It was a command dressed in the cheap clothes of commerce. It was the oldest, crudest form of financial infection. The money was dirty, and they wanted Elias to wash it, to bake it into the legitimacy of his small, honest business. They wanted to turn his sanctuary into a sewer. Elias looked at the bag, then back at Rico's expectant face. He could feel Maria's terror from the back of the room. It was a cold pressure against his spine. He had built this quiet life, this fragile peace, precisely to avoid moments like this. He had chosen invisibility. He had paid for it with everything he once was. To refuse was to become visible again. To accept was to break the one thing he had left. He pushed the bag back across the counter. A small, an inch-long slide on the polished wood. The gesture was quiet, but it was absolute. "I'm a baker," Elias said. "I sell bread. That's my business." Rico's smirk vanished. It was not a gradual change. It was as if a mask had dropped, revealing the crude ugliness beneath. His eyes narrowed. He looked from Elias's calm face to the bag of money, then back again. A flicker of disbelief, then a surge of anger that darkened his complexion. He was a man accustomed to the easy language of fear, and Elias was not speaking it. "What did you say?" he asked. The question was a low growl. The performance was over. This was the real man, stripped of his cheap veneer of authority. This was the thug. "I said I sell bread," Elias repeated. His voice did not change. It remained a flat, calm statement of fact. Rico's laugh was a harsh, barking sound that had no humor in it. It was the sound of a predator enjoying the fear of its prey, except the prey was refusing to act afraid. He leaned forward, his hands planting flat on the counter, bringing his face closer to Elias's. "Listen to me, you flour-dusted clown. This isn't a negotiation. This is how it is. You are now in business with Mr. Sylvan. This money, it stays here. It gets clean. Or this nice little shop of yours, this little hobby, it gets a new paint job." Red. You understand me? He gestured vaguely with his head toward the back of the shop, where Maria was trying to make herself invisible, her small frame pressed against the stainless steel dishwasher. And maybe your old cleaning lady has an accident, slips on a wet floor. Tragic. Things happen in the city every day. The threat, crude and artless, hung in the air. It was a clumsy weapon, but a lethal one. It was aimed not at Elias, but at the most vulnerable person in the room. It was the classic maneuver of the coward, to use the innocent as a shield and a target. Elias's gaze shifted past Rico's shoulder. He saw Maria. She had her eyes closed, her lips moving in a silent, desperate prayer. Her fear was no longer a cold pressure. It was a physical blow. He saw not just a frightened old woman, but the sum of all the bullies and thugs who built their petty empires on the backs of the powerless. Rico, mistaking Elias's silence for capitulation, straightened up, his confidence returning. He patted the duffel bag. See? Not so hard. I'll be back Friday. Have a nice day. He turned, ready to leave, his victory assured. He believed the transaction was complete. He had delivered the threat, established the terms. The baker would fold. They always did. But Elias had not folded. He had solidified. The threat against Maria had not broken him. It had forged him. In that moment, he was no longer a man hiding from his past. He was a man defined by it. The years of self-imposed exile, of quiet penance, fell away. He looked at the bag of money on his counter. It was a poison. It was a desecration of the one clean thing he had left in his life. And he knew, with a certainty that was as pure and absolute as the heat of his oven, that it could not stay there. Elias looked from the bag of money to the man's retreating back. He saw the arrogant slump of Rico's shoulders, the swagger of a man who believed he had won. Then his gaze shifted to the back of the shop, to Maria. She had not moved. Her eyes were still closed, but a single tear was tracing a path through the faint dusting of flour on her cheek. It was a map of her despair. In her fear, Elias saw the echo of another's pain. He saw his father's face in the last days, the look of a good man broken not by a single blow, but by 1,000 cuts from a system designed to protect the corrupt. His father, the architect, who had spoken of integrity as if it were a physical law of the universe. A structure must be true to its materials, his father had once told him, his large, calloused hand resting on a blueprint that was more art than engineering. A foundation of lies will never hold the weight of truth, son. It doesn't matter how beautiful the facade is. The cracks will always show. Eventually it all comes down. That memory, long buried under a weight of grief and failure, rose to the surface. It was not a ghost. It was a girder. It was the foundational principle he had tried to live by, had failed to defend, and had run from ever since. The money on the counter was a lie. It was a faulty foundation. To accept it, to build it into the structure of his life, would be the final betrayal of his father's memory. It would be an admission that the bullies always win, that integrity was a fool's game. He could feel the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second a hammer blow against the silence. Rico had almost reached the door. Maria remained frozen, a statue of quiet terror. The city outside was beginning to stir. The first sounds of traffic, a distant murmur. This was the moment. The pivot. The point from which there would be no return to the quiet, invisible life he had so carefully constructed. The fortress he had built was about to be tested. He could let the man walk out, accept the poison into his sanctuary, and live with the shame. He could survive, or he could act. He could be what he was. His choice was not a choice. It was a conclusion. It was the only possible outcome of an equation that had been written into his soul long ago. He was his father's son. The foundation had to be true. He reached for the duffel bag. The canvas was rough under his fingers. The weight was obscene. It was the weight of extortion, of fear, of human misery compressed into stacks of paper. Rico heard the sound of the bag being moved and half-turned, a questioning look on his face, the smirk already reforming. He thought the baker was moving the money to a safe place. He thought the deal was done. He was wrong. Elias did not hesitate. There was no anger in his face, no grand gesture of defiance. There was only a cold, quiet purpose. He lifted the heavy duffel bag from the counter. Rico watched him, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. The baker was not putting the bag under the counter. He was not taking it to the back office. He was walking. He walked past the racks of cooling bread, his steps steady and silent on the worn floorboards. He walked past Rico, who stood dumbfounded, his hand on the doorknob. Elias's path was direct. He walked toward the steamy alcove at the back of the shop, toward the clatter and hum of the dishwashing station. He walked toward Maria. She opened her eyes as he approached, flinching as if expecting a blow. She saw the bag in his hands, and her face, already pale, lost its last trace of color. She thought he was bringing the problem to her, implicating her, punishing her for being the source of the conflict. On the damp stainless steel counter next to the sink sat a simple glass jar. It was a large old pickle jar, its label long since scrubbed away. Inside, it was a third full of a sad collection of crumpled dollar bills, quarters, and dimes. It was her tip jar, a small, hopeful vessel in a sea of hardship. It was the physical manifestation of her daily struggle, of her hope for Mateo. Elias stopped in front of her. He did not say a word. He held the duffel bag over the jar. For a moment, the three of them, Elias, Maria, and the stunned Rico by the door, were frozen in a tableau of disbelief. Then, with a single, deliberate motion, Elias upended the bag. It did not make a dramatic sound, just a soft, thick cascade. A river of green and white paper flowed out of the bag. Stacks of $100 bills bound in paper bands tumbled into the pickle jar, filling it instantly. They overflowed, spilling out onto the wet counter, piling up around the base of the jar, falling to the damp floor with soft thuds. The sheer volume of it was shocking, obscene. A mountain of illicit cash, mingling with soap suds and the grime of a long morning's work. It was an act of such profound, absurd defiance that it transcended insult. It was a complete and total reframing of reality. The last bill fluttered down. Elias dropped the empty canvas bag to the floor. He looked at Maria, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and utter incomprehension. Her hands were trembling. "For your grandson," Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the thick silence of the room. It was not a suggestion. It was a verdict. Rico stood by the door, his mouth slightly agape. The entire sequence had taken less than 10 seconds, but the world had inverted. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been annihilated. This was a gesture he had no framework to understand. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't an argument. It was a statement of such magnificent contempt that it left no room for a response. He had come in as a predator, a man of power and intimidation, and this baker, this nobody, had taken his weapon, the money, the symbol of his boss's authority, and turned it into an act of charity. He had used it as garbage, as a donation to the lowest person on the social ladder in this room. He had rendered the money, and by extension Rico himself, utterly meaningless. The color drained from Rico's face. A deep, blotchy red of pure fury rose up his neck. He sputtered, his mind struggling to form a coherent threat. You're dead," he stammered, the words clumsy, robbed of their intended menace. "Do you know what you just did? That's Mr. Sylvan's money." Elias turned to face him. He did not raise his voice. He did not adopt a threatening posture. He simply stood there, a man made of stillness and resolve. He had crossed a line, and he knew it. The quiet life was over. The fortress had been breached from within, by his own hand. but for the first time in years, he felt the solid ground of his father's principles beneath his feet. He was no longer hiding. "It's in a tip jar," Elias said, his voice flat. "If he wants it, he can come and get it himself." He then took a single step forward, placing himself between Rico and Maria. The movement was small, but it was a declaration. It was a line drawn on the floor. It said, "You will not touch her. You will not pass." Rico looked from the mountain of cash on the wet floor to Elias's unmoving form. He saw no fear in the baker's eyes. He saw only a calm, unnerving certainty. The thug's instinct for self-preservation, long dormant under layers of arrogance, kicked in. This was not a situation that could be resolved with his limited toolset of bluster and crude violence. This was something else, something he needed to report. He fumbled for the doorknob, his movements suddenly clumsy, his bravado shattered. "You're a dead man," he repeated, but the words were hollow now, a pathetic echo of his earlier threat. He wrenched the door open and stumbled out into the gray morning light, leaving a wake of silence behind him. The bell above the door gave a final, mournful clang. The bakery was quiet again, but it was a new kind of quiet. It was the silence of a bomb that had been armed. The silence after the pin has been pulled. Maria stared at the money, her hands pressed to her mouth, and began to weep. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy, weighted with the gravity of what had just occurred. It was the silence of a courtroom after a verdict has been read. Maria's sobs were the only sound, small, hiccuping gasps of fear and disbelief. She looked at the pile of cash as if it were a venomous snake coiled on her countertop. Her first instinct was to push it away, to deny its existence. "No, no," she whispered, her voice trembling. She began to scoop the wet bills with shaking hands, trying to stuff them back into the empty duffel bag on the floor. "Please, Senor. You cannot. They will kill you. They will kill us." Elias gently placed his hand over hers, stopping the frantic motion. Her skin was cold and damp. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he let her see past the stoic mask of the baker. He let her see the resolve. "It is done, Maria," he said softly. "The money is yours. You will use it for Mateo. This is not a discussion." Her tears flowed freely now, but the terror in her eyes was being replaced by a dawning, terrifying hope. The sum of money on her workstation was not just life-changing. It was life-giving. It was the miracle she had been praying for, delivered by the hand of a gangster and a quiet baker. She looked from Elias to the money and back again, her mind unable to bridge the gap between the morning's routine and this impossible reality. Elias knew they had little time. Rico's retreat was not a victory. It was a prelude. He would go back to his boss, Mr. Sylvan, and report the insult. The response would be swift and decisive, but Elias was not panicking. The years of forced inactivity, of hiding, were over. A part of him that had been dormant for a decade was now awake, and it was thinking, planning, moving. He was no longer just a baker. He was the man he used to be, the man who navigated labyrinths of data, who thought in terms of strategy and consequence. First, he helped Maria gather the cash. They dried the wet bills under the warm glow of the heat lamps used to keep pastries fresh. It was a surreal image, hundreds of thousands of dollars laid out next to croissants and danishes. He found a sturdy cardboard box that had once held 50 pounds of bread flour. They packed the money inside, taped it shut, and he handed it to her. "Go home, Maria," he said. "Do not go to the bank, not yet. Call the hospital. Tell them you can provide the funds. Start the process. Stay with your family. Do not come back here." She clutched the box to her chest as if it were a child. She wanted to argue, to protest, but the command in his voice was absolute. She saw that he was no longer just her quiet employer. He was a man taking control, a man with a plan she could not begin to comprehend. She nodded, her face a mess of tears and gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for the magnitude of the moment. "God be with you, Señor." He watched her leave through the back door, a small, stooped woman carrying a box, heavy with a terrible, beautiful burden. When she was gone, the bakery felt vast and empty. The stage was now his alone. He did not bake. The dough for the day's second batch sat in its tubs, proofing, forgotten. Instead, he began to clean. It was a methodical, almost ritualistic process. He scrubbed the wooden counter where Rico had slammed down the bag, removing every trace of his presence, every molecule of his cheap cologne. He swept the floor, not just where the money had fallen, but every corner of the shop. He polished the glass of the display case until it gleamed. He was not just cleaning. He was preparing a space. He was clearing the board for a new game. When the bakery was immaculate, he went into the small office in the back. It was a cramped room with a desk, a chair, and a single, outdated computer he used for inventory. From a loose floorboard beneath the desk, he retrieved a small, lead-lined box. Inside was a burner phone and a small, leather-bound notebook. He had not touched these objects in 7 years. He powered on the phone. It came to life with a generic chime. He flipped through the notebook. The pages were filled with a dense, coded shorthand only he could understand. It was a map of his former life, a network of contacts, favors owed, and back channels of information. He found the entry he was looking for. It was not a name, but a sequence of numbers and a symbol. He dialed a number from memory. It rang 3 times before a sterile, automated voice answered. "Please leave your message." He did not speak for a long moment. He was reintroducing himself to a world he had abandoned. "The foundation is cracked at the Thorn building," he said, his voice low and clear. "Tell them the architect's son is back on site." He ended the call and immediately removed the battery and SIM card from the phone, crushing the card under his heel. He placed the dead phone back in its box and returned it to the floor. The message was sent. It was a flare fired into the darkness of his past, a signal he hoped would be seen by the right person, or at least, by an enemy of his enemy. He spent the rest of the day waiting. He sat on a stool behind the counter, the immaculate, empty bakery stretching out before him. He did not read. He did not pace. He simply sat, a figure of profound stillness, as the sun arced across the sky. The city hummed and roared outside, oblivious. Customers came to the door, found it locked, and left, confused. The day bled into evening. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows into the shop. The air grew cold. The waiting was the hardest part. It was a test of nerve. He was a sentry at his post, guarding a frontier he himself had created. He was waiting for the consequences to arrive, and he knew they would not be coming in a flashy car with a loud-mouthed thug behind the wheel. The response to an act of this magnitude would be quiet, personal, and final. The headlights that sliced through the twilight were not the garish blue-white of a modern luxury car. They were a warm, classic yellow, belonging to a vehicle that spoke of old money and older power. A black sedan, long and low, slid to a silent stop in front of the bakery. It was a vintage Bentley, restored to a condition that was beyond perfect. It absorbed the light of the street lamps, its finish as deep and dark as a starless night sky. The engine did not growl. It purred, a sound of immense, restrained power. The driver's door opened, and a man in a simple black suit emerged. He did not look at the bakery. He moved to the rear passenger door and opened it with a quiet reverence. For a moment, nothing happened. The open door was a dark rectangle, a portal. Then a man emerged from the car. He was not large. He was not physically imposing in the way a bodyguard or a thug was. His power came from a different source. It was in his stillness. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit him with the precision of a second skin, a dark silk tie knotted perfectly at his throat. His hair was silver at the temples, cut short and neat. His face was lean, his features sharp, as if carved from a hard, expensive wood. He looked to be in his late 50s, a man at the peak of his authority. This was Mr. Sylvan. He did not enter immediately. He stood on the sidewalk, his hands clasped behind his back, and simply looked at the small brick building. He was not casing it. He was assessing it. He took in the clean windows, the simple, hand-painted sign, the warm light spilling from within. His eyes, dark and intelligent, missed nothing. He was like a collector appraising a piece of art, determining its authenticity, its value. After a long, silent moment, he gave a slight nod, almost to himself, and moved toward the door. The driver remained by the car, a silent, motionless sentinel. Elias watched him approach. He felt no fear. The frantic energy of the morning had settled into a cold, hard calm. This was the moment he had been preparing for, not just all day, but for the last 7 years. This was the reckoning. The door opened without a sound. Sylvan stepped inside, bringing with him the chill of the night air and an aura of absolute authority that seemed to suck the warmth from the room. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The bakery was no longer Elias's sanctuary. It was Sylvan's court. He did not speak. His gaze swept the room, taking in the same details he had observed from the outside, but with a new level of scrutiny. He saw the gleaming counters, the orderly racks, the floor so clean it reflected the low lights. His eyes lingered on the proofing tubs, where the dough had long since overproofed and collapsed, a silent testament to a day's work abandoned. Then his eyes found what they were looking for: the back of the shop, the steamy alcove, the dishwashing station, and on the counter, next to the sink, the absurdly out-of-place pickle jar, now empty. He walked toward it, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the tiles. He stopped and looked at the jar, then at the faint, damp outlines on the counter where the stacks of cash had rested. A ghost of the morning's insanity. He ran a single gloved finger over the counter. He looked at his fingertip. It was clean. Finally, he turned his attention to Elias, who had remained standing behind the front counter. The two men looked at each other across the length of the silent shop. It was not a standoff. It was an evaluation. Sylvan's face was unreadable, a mask of cold neutrality. He was a man who had built an empire on his ability to read people, to find their weaknesses, their price, their breaking point. He was looking for Elias's. "What is your name?" Sylvan asked. His voice was quiet, a low baritone that was not meant to carry, yet it filled the entire room. It was the voice of a man who never had to raise it. "Elias," the baker replied, his own voice steady. Sylvan gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Elias the baker," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the words. He took a few steps closer, stopping in front of the display of bread. He picked up one of the baguettes Elias had baked that morning. He held it in both hands, feeling its weight, its balance. He examined the crust, the deep golden color, the perfect fissures created by the steam. He brought it to his nose and inhaled, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second. He was not just looking at bread. He was understanding it. He was reading the story of its creation, the care, the precision, the honesty of the ingredients. He broke a piece from the end. The sound of the crust crackling was loud in the silence. It was a perfect sound. He chewed the piece of bread slowly, thoughtfully. His expression did not change, but Elias felt a subtle shift in the man's assessment. Sylvan was a man who understood quality. He understood things that were made without compromise. Just as he swallowed, the front door burst open again, and Rico stumbled in, flanked by 2 other large men who looked like they were carved from the same crude block. Rico's face was a mess of sweat and fury. He had clearly worked himself into a rage, imagining this moment of retribution. "Boss," he started, pointing a trembling finger at Elias. "This is him. This is the guy. He's the one who—" Sylvan raised a single hand, a small, almost lazy gesture. The word died in Rico's throat. The two large men froze. The sudden, absolute silence was more intimidating than any shout. Sylvan did not turn to look at them. His eyes remained fixed on Elias. He took another small bite of the bread, savoring it. "Tell me what happened," Sylvan said, his voice still quiet, directed only at Elias. He was not interested in Rico's hysterical version of events. He wanted the truth from the source. Elias recounted the morning's events. He did not embellish. He did not justify. He spoke in short, declarative sentences, laying out the facts like he was arranging tools on a workbench. "Your man came in. He made a business proposition. He threatened my employee. I declined his offer." Sylvan's eyes flickered for a moment at the mention of the threat to Maria. "Where is the money now?" he asked. "I gave it to her," Elias said. "Her grandson is sick. She needs it for surgery." Rico made a choked, incredulous sound from the doorway. "He gave it away, boss. He threw it in the dirt. He gave it to the cleaning lady." Sylvan turned his head slowly, deliberately, and looked at Rico for the first time. The look was not one of anger. It was one of cold, profound disappointment. It was the look a master craftsman gives a flawed tool that has just ruined a valuable piece of work. "I sent you to make a simple business arrangement, Rico," Sylvan said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a blade of ice. "I sent you to a place that makes good bread, a place of quality. And you chose to behave like a common thug in a back alley. You threatened an old woman. But boss, he disrespected you. He disrespected the whole organization," Rico pleaded, his voice cracking. Sylvan took a step toward him. "Respect, Rico? You don't know the first thing about it. You think respect is fear? You think it's bullying a man who works with his hands, a man who creates something of quality, something honest?" He held up the piece of baguette. "This has more integrity than you will ever have. This is real. You are a cheap copy." He walked past Rico to the door, where the two other thugs stood, uncertain and afraid. Sylvan did not even glance at them. He stopped in front of Rico, his face now inches from the terrified man's. "You embarrassed me," he said, the words a quiet venom. "You went into a man's place of business, and you brought shame. You are a liability. We are done. Get out of my sight." It was not a firing. It was an erasure. Rico stared, his world crumbling. He had expected violence, a beating. This was worse. This was exile. This was humiliation in front of his peers, delivered by the man he most feared and revered. His face, which had been red with fury, was now a pasty, sickly white. He stumbled backward, turned, and fled into the night, a man who had just ceased to exist in the world that mattered to him. The other two men, seeing their leader broken and dismissed, simply melted away after him, disappearing into the darkness. The silence returned. Sylvan stood by the door for a moment, his back to Elias. He seemed to be composing himself, shedding the unpleasantness of the encounter. When he turned back, his face was once again a mask of calm neutrality, but his eyes held a new light. It was a look of appraisal, but also of a strange, burgeoning respect. "Elias the baker," he said again, the title now sounding less like a label and more like an honorific. "You have caused me a significant inconvenience, and a significant expense." He walked back to the counter, his composure fully restored. He was no longer a crime boss confronting a problem. He was a man of business, a connoisseur of rare things, and he had just found something very rare indeed. An honest man who could not be bought or intimidated. "My mother," Sylvan said, his voice losing its hard edge, becoming almost conversational. "She is in a nursing home. An old woman. Not so different, perhaps, from your Maria. The women who care for her, they are not paid well. They work hard. They are decent. They have a dignity that money cannot buy. I make sure they are looked after. Discreetly. It is a matter of respect. For them. For my mother. He was revealing a small piece of himself, a crack in the marble facade. It was not a confession. It was a connection. He was explaining his code, the internal architecture of his morality. He was showing Elias that he understood the principle behind the morning's reckless act. The money was a test, Sylvan continued, looking directly at Elias. A test of my organization. A test of my man's judgment. He failed. You, on the other hand, you passed. The money was dirty. Now it is clean. It will save a child's life. It has been put to a better use than I ever intended for it. As far as I am concerned, it is a gift. A bonus for my former employee's spectacular incompetence. Elias listened, saying nothing. He understood that this was not absolution. It was a transaction of a different kind. Sylvan was not forgiving the debt. He was recategorizing it. He was turning a liability into an asset in his own mental ledger. But this leaves me with a problem, Sylvan said, leaning against the counter, adopting the same posture Rico had earlier. But on him, it was not a performance of dominance. It was a gesture of relaxed, absolute power. I have an irritation. A man who believes he is smarter than he is. A developer. His name is Marcus Thorne. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. It was a ghost from a past he thought he had buried forever. Thorne. The man who had destroyed his father. The man whose empire of corruption he had tried and failed to expose. The man who was the very reason for his 7 years of exile in this bakery. A cold dread, colder than any fear of Sylvan, washed over him. Sylvan saw the flicker in his eyes. He saw the recognition, the sudden tension in Elias's shoulders. His lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. It was not a smile of humor. It was the smile of a grandmaster who has just placed his opponent in a checkmate he had planned 10 moves ago. Thorne is laundering money, Sylvan said. He is doing it clumsily, arrogantly. He is using properties that are connected to my legitimate interests, and his sloppiness is attracting the wrong kind of attention. Federal attention. He has become a splinter under my nail. My own people are too close to it. They cannot see the whole picture. I need an outsider, an expert, someone who can see in the dark. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. He looked at Elias, his gaze penetrating. I have been hearing whispers for years, rumors of a man they called the Ghost, a forensic accountant of prodigious talent, a man who could follow a single dollar through 1,000 shell corporations, a man who disappeared after a failed attempt to expose a certain corrupt developer. The room was utterly still. The identity Elias had worked so hard to shed, to bury under layers of flour and routine, was being laid bare under the cold lights of his own bakery. A few hours ago, Sylvan continued, his voice now a soft murmur, an old friend of mine in a very different line of work received a cryptic message. Something about a crack in the foundation of a Thorne building. Something about an architect's son. He knew I had an interest in Thorne, so he passed the message to me. He straightened up, his evaluation complete. He knew. He knew everything. The pieces clicked into place. The message Elias had sent was a shot in the dark, aimed at the nebulous world of financial intelligence, hoping to find an old ally. Instead, it had been intercepted and rerouted through the city's shadow network, landing on the one desk he never could have anticipated. I am not looking for a baker, Elias, Sylvan said, his voice now crisp. All business. I am looking for a ghost. Marcus Thorne destroyed your father. He is now causing problems for me. It seems our interests are aligned. I want you to find it. Find the proof. Find the one thread that will allow me to pull his entire rotten structure down. I will give you whatever resources you need. In return, you will give me Thorne, and you will have the justice you were denied all those years ago. It was not an offer. It was a key. It was a key to a locked room in Elias's own soul, the room that held his rage, his grief, and his burning, unfinished purpose. Sylvan was offering him the one thing he had thought he would never have again: a chance to finish the fight, to vindicate his father, to make the foundation true. Elias looked around his bakery, at the cooling loaves of bread, the clean counters, the quiet order he had created. It had been a good fortress. It had kept him safe. But it was also a prison. He had been hiding not from the world, but from himself. Sylvan was offering him a way out, a dangerous, bloody, and compromised way out. But it was a way. He thought of Maria, of the impossible hope he had handed her in a cardboard box. He had stepped out of the shadows for her. Now he had to step out for himself, for his father. "When do I start?" Elias asked. The baker was gone. The ghost was back. Weeks passed. The city moved into the deeper chill of late autumn. On the forgotten street corner, the bakery remained dark. A simple, closed for renovations sign was taped to the inside of the door. The life that had existed there, the warm breath of yeast, and the quiet rhythms of work, had vanished. In a sterile pediatric ward across town, a small boy named Mateo was learning to walk again. The experimental surgery, paid for in a single, untraceable wire transfer from an offshore humanitarian fund, had been a success. His grandmother Maria sat by his bedside, her gnarled hands holding his small one. The deep lines of worry on her face had not disappeared, but they were softer now, gentler. A smile touched her lips as Mateo took a shaky, triumphant step. It was a smile of pure, uncomplicated grace. She no longer looked over her shoulder. The fear had been replaced by a quiet, fierce gratitude for a miracle she would never fully understand, delivered by a quiet baker who had simply disappeared. High above the city, in a penthouse apartment that was less a home and more a command center, Elias stared at a bank of monitors. The space was minimalist, cold, furnished in glass and black leather. It was a world away from the warm, flour-dusted bakery. He wore not an apron, but a simple, dark sweater. He had lost the baker's pallor, and the muscles in his shoulders and back, once conditioned by lifting sacks of flour and kneading dough, were now coiled in the stillness of deep concentration. He had not baked a single loaf of bread in over a month. He had not missed it. The screens in front of him were not displaying recipes or inventory. They were filled with flowing columns of numbers, transaction logs, encrypted communications, and architectural blueprints of shell corporations. It was the digital soul of Marcus Thorne's empire, a vast, interconnected web of deceit. To a normal eye, it was an impenetrable wall of data. To Elias, it was a language he had been born to speak. For weeks, he had been immersed in it, sleeping only a few hours a night on a sofa in the corner. He moved through the terabytes of information with the same patient, methodical precision he had once used on his dough. He was not looking for a single dramatic piece of evidence. That was the amateur's mistake. Thorne was too smart for that. He had buried his crimes under 1,000 layers of legitimate transactions, legal loopholes, and plausible deniability. Elias was looking for something else. He was looking for the flaw in the design. He was looking for the hairline crack in the foundation. His father had taught him that every structure, no matter how complex, has a load-bearing point, a place where the stress is most concentrated. In a corrupt financial empire, that point was almost always where the dirty money first touched the clean, the point of conversion. He found it not in a massive, multi-million-dollar transfer, but in a small, recurring payment. A monthly consulting fee of a few $1,000s, paid from one of Thorne's primary construction firms to a landscaping company. The company was called Eden Ecological Design. It was a boutique firm, well regarded, with a portfolio of green roofs and sustainable urban gardens. On the surface, it was perfect. Clean, progressive, utterly benign. But the payments were coded with an anomaly that only someone like Elias would notice. A single, misplaced integer in the transaction's metadata. It was a digital fingerprint, A tiny, repeating error. It was a signature. Following that signature, Elias unspooled the thread. Eden Ecological Design was owned by a trust. The trust was administered by a law firm in the Cayman Islands, and the sole beneficiary of that trust was a woman named Eleanor Vance. A quick search revealed that Eleanor Vance was the maiden name of Marcus Thorne's wife. It was a classic structure, but executed with an arrogant flaw. The recurring payment was small, insignificant, designed to be lost in the noise of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. It was the private slush fund, the pocket money. It was the one place Thorne had allowed sentiment to override security. Elias isolated the transaction stream. He cross-referenced it with the landscaping company's actual project invoices. The consulting fees had no corresponding work orders. They were ghosts in the machine. He then pulled up satellite imagery and city planning documents for Thorne's flagship downtown tower, the one whose construction had bankrupted his own father's honest firm. He found the green roof project that Eden Ecological Design had supposedly installed. According to the invoices, it was a lush, multi-level garden. The satellite photos showed a barren, gravel-covered roof. The money had been paid. The work had not been done. He leaned back in his chair. The thread was in his hand. It was small, but it was pure. It connected Thorne's corporate entity directly to his personal finances through a fraudulent transaction. It was the first crack. From here, he could place the entire structure under stress. He could subpoena the landscaping company, the trust, the offshore law firm. The lie about the garden would unravel, and with it, the entire carefully constructed wall between Thorne's corporate and personal worlds would crumble. Once that wall was breached, everything else, the bid rigging, the kickbacks, the systemic corruption that had destroyed his father, would be exposed to the light. A soft chime announced the arrival of the private elevator. The doors slid open, and Mr. Sylvan stepped into the room. He was dressed, as always, in a perfectly tailored suit. He walked over to the bank of monitors, his eyes scanning the data Elias had highlighted on the central screen. He said nothing, but his stillness was one of rapt attention. "The landscaping company," Elias said, his voice quiet. "It's the load-bearing wall." Sylvan looked at the screen, at the lines of code that connected a powerful developer to a fake rooftop garden. He didn't understand the specifics of the data, but he understood the conclusion. He understood the look in Elias's eyes. It was the look of a master craftsman who has found the fatal flaw in his rival's work. A slow, appreciative smile touched Sylvan's lips. It was a smile of pure, cold satisfaction. "The architect's son," he murmured, more to himself than to Elias. He placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. It was not a gesture of familiarity. It was a gesture of respect, of recognition. "You have done well." Elias looked at the screen, at the unraveling empire of the man who had taken everything from him. He felt no elation. He felt no thirst for revenge. He felt only a quiet, profound sense of completion. He was not a baker. He was not a ghost. He was a son, finishing the work his father had started. The numbers on the screen were not just data. They were a testament. They were a memorial. A foundation built on lies cannot stand. It only needs one man to find the first crack.